changes we can see in Unit 1 can be early migrations that came from a crossing of an ancient land bridge into the Americas over the Bering Strait into what is now Alaska. These migrations were the result of the developments of stone tools like spears. All these land-based migrants are known to scholars as the Clovis people. Change can be the migration of European explorers to America in search for new territories. Conquistadors paved the way for the early colonization of the Americas as well as new trade goods going to Europe. The Black Death, a catastrophic epidemic of the bubonic plague, was one of the reasons for the search of new territories. The change we can see is Englishmen immigrating to the New World due to money-making opportunities. Prior to the 1650, many Englishmen immigrated to the New World, specifically to the North American colonies. People saw that moving to the North American colonies was a great money-making opportunity, especially growing sugars on islands off the North American coast, which was very much profitable. The fourth change we can see are Spanish explorers establishing the first permanent European settlement known as St. Augustine, which served as a military outpost, an administrative center for Franciscan missionaries, and a headquarters for unsuccessful campaigns against North American natives that were ultimately abandoned. The last change we can see can be first sedentary settlements that are beginning to form, mainly in agricultural areas where they were creating the basis for larger civilizations like the Incas, for example, who created the largest groups in the Americas. Some continuities we can see in Unit 1 can be agriculture supporting migration from Mexico into the American Southwest with the spread of maize, beans, and squash, along with the fact that it supported economic settlement among societies like the Pueblo. Another change you can see are societies moving around due to the arid nature of the Great Basin, along with the grasslands of the Great Plains, by having largely mobile lifestyles. The Comanche and the Sioux exerted control over large territories as a result of this. Another continuity we can see are tribes settling near the coastal regions to gain resources, for example, the Californian people, that benefited from these resources like oak trees, acorns, along with seaweed. We can also see a continuity in the New World's newness being the reason for migration for explorers. They contrasted their troubled land as a reason to migrate, and it seemed as a land where human settlement could start anew, where a perfect society could be created without flaws and iniquities of the old world. Our last continuity we can see are native people getting land taken away due to migration. As soon as the Spanish and English migrated to the Americas in search for new lands, the native people's land was taken away and used to create civilizations.
So, a change that could be for this time period would be the replace of the encomienda system, which was developed by the Spanish, but this was replaced because of the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. Another change could be how labor workers maintain an emphasis on family. So, due to the fact that indentured servants could bring their families with them and they could send letters back home, they already kind of had it, but Africans created surrogate relatives because they were ripped from their homes and forced to come to the New World. You also have the first successful colony settled by the English, which was Jamestown. You see more hostility towards natives from the English colonists because before they kind of wanted to maintain separate from them, but as time moved on and they had to expand their lands and they got closer and closer to the natives, you had the Powhatan Confederacy that was destroyed by the English Indian fighters, so we see them more hostile. You also have the rise of epidemic diseases such as smallpox, influenza, measles, and this was brought over by the Europeans when they migrated, and it heavily affected the Native Americans that were not used to these things. Some continuities that we can see include settlers removing people from their homes to perform labor for them. For example, we have the Spanish settlers utilizing the encomienda system, the English settlers using indentured servitude, and we have chattel slavery as well. We see a continuation of territorial disputes. For example, we have the Pequot War, which was the natives fighting back to English settlers going onto their land, essentially, and we have the French and Indian War, which is over the dominance of the fur trade in the different areas that they were migrating to. There's also a continuity of settlers utilizing Native Americans for their own advantages. For example, in the Comienda system, the Spanish used it for them to gather wealth for them. The Spanish and Algonquin alliance and the British and Iroquois alliance was just for them to be able to control fur trade in those areas. We also see a continuity of migration due to wanting to spread religion. For example, we have Spanish missionaries that wanted to spread Christianity, and we have French Jesuit priests that wanted to spread Roman Catholicism, however you say it. And we also see migration with the purpose of trying to find resources as a continuity. We have the French looking for gold and a shortcut to Asia. We have the Spanish looking for sugar and silver. And we have the British that were really trying to find some gold.
One of the changes in Unit 3 was a huge expansion of slavery in the Deep South due to mechanization and other advances. Short staple cotton could now be grown with less water, which made movement inland by whites and also caused the creation of cotton kingdoms. Another change during Unit 3 was that settlement in the Northwest was facilitated by the Northwest Ordinances, the first of their kind. It allowed for public schooling, protection of private property, and banned slavery, and it was an orderly way for admitting new states. Another change was that diplomatic initiatives with Spain limited southward expansion, such as Bigny's Treaty, which created a cutoff line for American expansion south, as well as the creation of Spanish mission settlements. Another change was U.S. attempts to protect Native American settlements from white migration. Article 6 in the U.S. Constitution decided to protect Native treaties with Americans. Despite this, Native treaties with Americans were not really respected. Lastly, another change was restrictive policies towards immigration due to the Alien and Sedition Acts by John Adams, which included a naturalization clause, which provided that immigrants must reside for 14 years in order to become citizens, which caused a decline in immigration to the United States by Europeans. The first continuity in this unit is that there is continued expansion west. The Scots and Irish moved beyond the Appalachians, and victory in the French and Indian War only serves to encourage U.S. expansion westward. Another continuity that can be found in this unit is that the British continued to try stopping American westward expansion when we were a colony. In the Proclamation of 1763, they tried to ban movement into the Appalachian region. Another continuity that can be found is Native peoples trying to limit white expansion. This could be seen during the Revolutionary War, in which the Iroquois and many other tribes allied with Britain, since Britain had promised to protect many Native American lands. Another continuity in this period is that the Spanish continued expanding mission settlements and included the natives as part of their mission settlements, which led to the development of a distinct culture blend between native and Spanish culture. Lastly, another continuity is that Americans continue expanding northwest, which can be seen in Jay's Treaty, in which the British give the U.S. land concessions in Canada, so the U.S. can continue expanding into the northwest.
One change that occurred in Unit 4 was the emergence of new government-funded roads facilitating internal migration, such as the National Road, stretching from the Potomac River to the Ohio River. The roads made transportation costs across the mountains lower than ever before and allowed manufacturers to move from the Atlantic seaboard to the Ohio Valley in unprecedented quantities. Another change that occurred in Unit 4 would be the movement of international migrants into industrializing cities. Germans moved into the Midwest seeking political and economic freedom, while Eastern immigrants such as the Irish settled in cities such as New York, Boston, and Philadelphia after the Great Famine.
Another change in Unit 4 would be the relocation of slaveholder plantations to more fertile lands in the west of the Appalachians due to the depletion of arable land in the southeast. This further relocated slaves through forced migration, creating growing slave populations in the Middle South regions.
Another change in Unit 4 would be the movement of transcendentalists into isolated places to form utopian communities. These internal migration of transcendentalists was in response to rationalism. One example is the Brook Farm in Roxbury, Massachusetts. Another change in Unit 4 would be the debates of the migration of slaves back to Africa. The American Colonization Society, founded in the South in 1817, opposed black slavery because it encouraged contact between the whites and the blacks. They urged slave owners to free their slaves and return them to Africa. Continuities in Unit 4 would include continued internal westward migration. After the Louisiana Purchase, the Lewis and Clark expedition allowed for the exploration of land west of St. Louis reaching up to the Pacific coast. The new notion of manifest destiny, coined by John O'Sullivan, allowed for the Americans to expand beyond the West. Another continuity in Unit 4 would be the forced migration of Native American populations. Americans continued to move west, moving from the Appalachians, driving new communities along the Ohio and Mississippi River. This facilitated further displacement of Native American population. They were forced out, and Supreme Court moved an Indian Territory with Indian Removal Act of 1830. Another continuity would be the continued movement of slaves running away to the north and to the free states. Many of these states were added due to the Missouri Compromise. Another continuity would be the continued movement north to the more urbanized and industrialized areas of the United States. These areas had more jobs and more opportunities for all people. Another continuity in Unit 4 would be the continued migration through railroads. Railroads were now the primary transportation systems, and they facilitated migration from the upper Midwest to the Northeast.
So some changes that we can see in Unit 5 could be the rise of nativism due to many German immigrants coming in for especially because they were Catholic and the US was mostly Protestant, so they developed parochial schools to kind of keep this Catholic influence out. A change that we also see could be the rise of white tribal policies, for example, the concentration policy, which forced natives out of their lands. And this essentially was just to make room for the white settlers that wanted to settle onto native land. Another change that we see would be internal migration north was rising because of people helping slaves escape the South and go to the North. For example, the Anti-Slavery Society did these things. Another change that we see could be increased migration due to religious refuge. For example, we have the Mormons that moved to Pennsylvania because they believed in things like polygamy, which made them be very looked down upon. We also see migration out of the U.S., and we can see this happening when people move to Mexico, because at the time Mexico still had Texas as one of their territories, so they wanted to encourage people from the U.S. to move there because they wanted to improve their own economy. A continuity we can see for Unit 5 could be the immigration from Asia, which was mostly from China due to the gold rush. We also see a continuity in westward migration with things like Manifest Destiny, and we also have the Homestead Act of 1862, which essentially stole 160 acres of land from the natives, and it sold it to promote westward expansion. We also see a continuity in Native American resistance to white settlers. We have the Sand Creek Massacre, and we also have Little Bighorn, which is when the Sioux tribe just got up and left the reserve that they were forced into so the white settlers could take their land. Another continuity could be immigration from Europe, from places such as Ireland and Germany. And finally, a continuity would be the debate over slavery that was especially there because of the Mexican Cession. We have abolitionists and slave owners moving to these newly acquired lands that were given to the U.S. by Mexico, and it raised the question of whether or not these would be slave states, and this debate over slavery continued.
Starting off with my changes, one change was a shift to a more restrictive immigration policy. The Chinese Exclusion Act is an example of this because it banned Chinese immigration to the United States and it barred the Chinese migrants already in the United States from becoming naturalized citizens. This significantly reduced Chinese immigration to the United States. Another change was a significant rise in ethnic communities formed by various ethnic groups. The influx of immigration led to a large immigration populations. Many national groups formed close-knit ethnic communities within the cities to help ease their transition into the United States and help maintain close ties with their native countries. Another change was a new source of immigration. In the 1870s and 1880s, most of the immigrants who came to the eastern industrial cities came from the nation's traditional sources, England, Ireland, and Northern Europe. By the end of the century, however, the major source of immigration had shifted, with large numbers of Southern and Eastern Europeans migrating to the United States. Another change was the emergence of the concept of social Darwinism. Herbert Spencer was a proponent of this theory. He argued that society benefited from the elimination of the unfit. William Graham Sumner of Yale University also promoted similar ideas, and can be seen in his book titled Folkways. Lastly, another change was the concentration policy aimed at the Native Americans. Not only did it significantly make Native Americans vacate and relocate onto different lands, it also divided up the tribes. Native Americans were forced to move into different scattered locations. Now starting off with my continuities. One continuity is the nativism that was met with significant rise in immigration. Since the era had a large influx of immigration, large anti-immigration sentiment arose, along with nativism. Groups like the Immigration Restriction League and the Anti-Coolie Clubs emerged. Another continuity is the increased migration and settlement of individuals to the western part of the United States. Anglo-Americans and African Americans moved to establish outposts, trade, farm, or become ranchers. The Homestead Act, the Timber Culture Act, and the Desert Land Act all provided large amounts of land for a low cost, which encouraged migration. Another continuity is the movement of wealthy and middle-class individuals to the suburbs. Many took advantage of the less expensive lands and settled at the edges of the city that were linked by trains or roads. Another continuity is a relocation of native tribes by the federal government. Many members of the Eastern Tribe, which include the Cherokees or the Creeks, were forced to resettle west of the Mississippi and into the Indian Territory. Lastly, another continuity is a large amount of immigrants in the workforce. As the demand for factory labor grew, many immigrants came to the United States to find new economic opportunities. The labor contract law permitted employers to pay for the passages of the workers, and later would deduct the cost from their wages. Foreign-born labor brokers also encouraged the immigration of unskilled workers into factories. One significant change was the Great Migration, which was the migration of thousands of African Americans from the rural South to the industrial North. Many African Americans migrated to the North to escape the racism, poverty, and violence of the South, and for the prospects of finding factory jobs and for more freedom and autonomy. Another change is the significant migration of farmers who left their homes due to the impacts of the Dust Bowl. The steady decline of rainfall and an increase in heat led to a rise in migration of farmers, who were known as Okies, from towns to towns for better economic opportunities. Another change in Period 7 is the steady decline of immigration to the United States due to World War I and the Great Depression. One change is the emergence of settlement houses that were directed towards helping immigrant families adapt to their new cultures, language, and customs. The most famous was a Hull House that opened in Chicago in 1889 by Jane Addams and became a model for other similar institutions. Another change is the treatment towards Japanese Americans and the forceful relocation by the War Relocation Authority. This is a change because it shows the treatment of immigrant groups, specifically the Japanese, and how they are forced to be relocated to different parts of the United States and into relocation centers. One continuity is the restrictiveness of immigration by the United States. The Emergency Immigration Act, also known as the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 and the National Origins Act of 1924, limited international immigration significantly. These two immigration policies severely reduced the number of immigrants admitted into the United States. Another continuity was increasing urbanization to industrial cities due to industrialization and the factory system. Urbanization greatly expanded and has been steadily increasing since the 1860s. The census of 1920s revealed for the first time that a majority of American people lived in urban areas. One continuity is the increase in Mexican migration into the United States. It greatly expanded during the Second World War due to labor shortages. American employers in some parts of the Southwest began recruiting Hispanic workers, and Hispanic workers were able to find a number of factory jobs. This greatly increased the amount of Mexican migrants in the United States. One continuity is the conflict and tensions between immigrants and Americans. An example of this is the Zoot Suit riots, where white residents of Los Angeles became alarmed at the activities of Mexican-American teenagers, and in 1943, animosity towards the Zooters produced a 4-day riot in Los Angeles. And lastly, another continuity is a nativist sentiment towards immigrants. Agitation for a curb on foreign immigration to the United States began in the 19th century and greatly expanded during this century. An example of this is the rise of the second KKK, which tried to put a limit and reduce foreign immigration to the United States.
Some changes we can see in Unit 8 can be the rise in Cuban immigration to the U.S., for example, with the Cuban-American War. After the Cuban-American War, U.S. taking over Cuba caused a continuous wave of Cubans settling in for refuge. We can also see a rise of European and Asian immigration due to the Immigration Reform Act of 1965 that lifted the national quotas imposed on immigration policy in 1924 and opened immigration to large areas of the world that had previously been restricted. 90% of immigrants to the United States came from Europe, and it had a profound impact upon Asian immigration. We can also see a rise of refugee migration to the United States. In 1952, the McCarran-Walter Act refugee policies were incorporated into immigration regulation. Because many of the newcomers had no connections in the United States, assistance was provided through voluntary social service networks. A fourth change can be the rise in liberalism expounding upon immigration. An increase in liberal beliefs in both societal norms and government usually leads to an increase in immigration. And for the last change, we can see a surging Latino immigration. In 1960, the census reported slightly more than 3 million Latinos living in the United States. By 1970, that number had grown to 9 million, and by 2009 to 48 million. Some continuities we can see in Unit 8 can be the African Americans migrating to the suburbs due to nativism. This increase in nativism caused the affluent whites living in the suburbs to exclude them with racial prejudices, leaving an unequal amount of African Americans and whites in the suburbs. Another continuity could be the U.S. leading in international migration due to less strict immigration policies. It has always been a leading destination in international migration since the 1970s and will probably continue to hold this position for many years to come. But government policy alone is not sufficient enough to control the flows of immigration completely. Another continuity we can see in Unit 8 can be the rise of conservatism and conservatives building a negative connotation towards immigrants coming into the United States. We can also see a continuity in migration to the U.S. from communist countries. We can see this in Korea during the Korean War, along with Cuba during the Cuban-American War. All throughout Unit 8, we can see a continuity in the rise of migration towards the middle class and the suburbs due to all the migration out of the South.
For our periodization, we decided that Unit 8 should end and Unit 9 should begin during 1965 due to the Immigration Reform Act of 1965. It was a significant turning point for immigration because it allowed for a massive influx of immigrants and it opened the floor for discourse as to how immigration should occur. Although it placed restrictions on the amount of immigrants admitted into the U.S., it eliminated the national origin system, which was established in the 1920s. This eliminated preference of immigrants and allowed for immigrants from all over the world to migrate to the U.S. One of the changes in Unit 9 was increased immigration from Latin America into the United States due to family provisions, Cold War conflicts, and civil wars in many Latin American countries. Another change during this time period was increased immigration from Asia due to the end of the National Origins Act, World War II and Cold War conflicts, and selective migration from India and China. Another change during this time period was that the settlement of immigrant workers was noticeably contributing to the economy due to the fact that undocumented workers still pay taxes, exploitative relationship between employers and undocumented employees, and a net gain for the government per immigrant on average. Lastly, a change during this time period was the Refugee Act of 1990, which legalized seasonal workers and gave temporary protected status to countries that were having conflicts such as natural disasters. Another change during this time period was the DREAM Act, which aided illegal immigrants in becoming citizens if they met certain qualifications, which encouraged immigration. A continuity during this time period is the demographic shift towards the Sunbelt region, and also the Detroit population was cut in half. Another continuity was the debate over policies about illegal immigration settlement, including the Immigration Control and Reform Act, dealing with the employment of illegal immigrants, as well as the debate whether it was better to wait for legalization process or looking for a better life in the U.S. Another continuity was anti-immigration sentiment. For example, in Arizona SB 1070, it allows officers to ask suspected illegals for documentation on the basis that they look illegal. Another continuity is that Latin America continues to dominate immigration, 58% of growth being by Latin Americans. Lastly, a continuity is that citizens were expanding in the West, the Sagebrush Rebellion being an example of that since they wanted to expand into government-owned land.